like to then do for pretty much most of today, and rather appropriate, that we kind of look at somewhat of a sub-theory of liberalism, the study of institutionalism, right when the UN General Assembly is meeting for its annual marathon of speeches that no one really pays attention to, and comes up with proposals for the new year that no one really bothers to implement. But still, the notion of institutionalism is something that is officially part of the school of liberalism, though realists have, over the years, grudgingly accepted that institutions certainly form part of the international arena. So it's worth beginning to note that institutionalism is a product of liberalist thinking. It stems from the liberalist school, with a number of if-then philosophies. We understood from last week, according to liberalism, that humans are, at least by nature, at least in their inner capacity, good. Okay? Humans have the capacity to do good in the world, but are led astray by circumstances of fear and uncertainty. Now, that's a basic liberalist principle, is that fear and uncertainty prevent people from doing good and, in effect, end up doing evil, or engaging in self-help, or all the types of things that realists look at and argue is self-evident. Okay, so if we're able to reduce the problems to fear and uncertainty, one would stand to reason that the reduction in degrees of fear and uncertainty would thus increase the chances for progress and development in the world. In other words, if uncertainty and fear are the driving forces behind realism, the reduction of these two things should restore equilibrium, should bring people back to some type of common cause, common ideology, common harmony. Okay, so if we reduce the degrees of fear and uncertainty, we should get in its inverse greater degrees of progress and development. Progress and development which can be seen more tangibly in signs of cooperation and consensus. In fact, cooperation and consensus can, in fact, lead to greater degrees of progress and development. It even stands to reason that cooperation and consensus is the exact opposite to fear and uncertainty. Okay? So if we start plugging in greater degrees of cooperation and consensus, not only do we get an increase in progress and development, but how does this come about? The fastest and easiest way for this to happen would be for an increase in interstate cooperation. The more states cooperate, and here we're not even talking about allying. Allying implies something temporary. Cooperation is something that seems more day-to-day. It seems something that goes beyond one particular treaty, one particular agreement. Cooperation is what one would think ongoing and perennial. So therefore, an increase in interstate cooperation brings the best chances for development and peace. It's a very simple set of beliefs. Okay? The more states cooperate, the greater the chances of peace, the greater the chances of stability, the greater the chances that war becomes increasingly less likely. Great. Wonderful. How does that happen? That's where institutions come in. International institutions. Or better yet, just simply the understanding of institutionalism as somewhat of a bridge of communication between states, both formally and informally. This is where institutions come in very, very nicely. And you can look at institutions today like the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, the World Health Organization, the Red Cross, what else? Amnesty International, right? They run the gamut, right? The United Nations is probably the closest thing that we have that looks something like a world government. But here's the thing about institutions. they do not, nor have they ever really come close to superseding the authority of the state. The state still remains the primary actor. Institutions serve as a mechanism for states to interact. So it's rather appropriate that we use the term bridge of communication, because institutions function as a sort of quote-unquote neutral territory. Whether it's the UN General Assembly, the European Parliament, whatever NATO has, to communicate with each other, whatever it happens to be, institutions serve as neutral territory for participating states to voice their grievances, share their thoughts, and hopefully come to some kind of agreements with each other. So a primary mechanism, a primary objective, therefore, of institutions is to work at diffusing potentially competing or even conflicting issues. Back in the olden days, when states were the only actors around, misinformation was what almost always led to either the outbreak of war in its final incantation, or prior to that, the things that led to a spiral effect that deteriorated relations, created security dilemmas, and ultimately resulted in war. What institutions do is it provides two critical factors: information and compromise. Information is probably the most important out of those two. Institutions work to reduce uncertainty. Institutions work to eliminate misperceptions between states. Institutions, if properly used, provide some clarity to the proverbial fog of war, the fog of uncertainty. So institutions provide information at the absolute least. And one would like to think that if information is there, is transparent, and is shared, we also can come to some form of compromise. Compromise that, if it results in something other than warfare, the institution has done its job. If we can come to some kind of agreement, some type of shared power structure, some type of legal binding document, people may not be happy with it completely, but if it avoids war, so much the better. Institutions also function as a way of increasing the degrees of communication and cooperation between states beyond formal diplomatic channels. This is somewhat of a paradox, because for something that is directly out of the school of liberalism, institutions give probably the most acknowledgement, the most attention to Waltz's third level of analysis, the individual level of analysis. Now, whether Waltz had coined it from liberalism is still, something up for grabs. The point here is that institutions serve to create cooperative agreements beyond simple, formal state interaction, more than just diplomat to diplomat, leader to leader, but also, most importantly, people to people. The best way to explain that is, of course, to show you. Okay? If you follow the realist paradigm, and you take Waltz's three levels of analysis at face value, you're going to come away with a very simple understanding of how the world works. Okay? The top level is the international level, which of course we know is anarchic. The middle level, the green, let's just say that that represents various states. Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, I don't know, Spain, whatever it is you want to call it. Okay? So we look at the green as states, to which we would then view, let's say, the red as the citizens, the subjects, the people who are in those states. Okay? In traditional IR, the individual level is effectively beholden to whatever the state does. Right? The state is the primary actor. States can interact with each other, and they can interact and be influenced by the international level. But individuals are kind of in this vacuum-sealed protective coating that is the state. Liberalism, simply from our discussion last week, challenges that notion and makes things far more complicated. Far more complicated. You're kind of looking at, oh, what the hell is that? Let me just do it bit by bit here, okay? Because we haven't even thrown institutions in just yet. Liberalism by itself acknowledges that people can not only interact with other people from other states, hence just the use of communication. I mean, the internet, Facebook, Skype, whatever it is that you want it to be. But liberalism also acknowledges that individuals can bypass the states and make their own effect on the international arena. Probably the best example of that was somebody came to visit us last week. Who came to visit us last week, who had pretty much rock star status? The Pope. The Pope. All right? You got any Catholics in the room? Your Pope is awesome. And I'm not even Catholic. Okay? This guy gets popularity ratings the likes of which elected officials in this country only dream of. He put John Boehner to tears multiple times. Even got him to resign in some cases. Like, oh, I see the error. This guy is awesome, beyond the Pope, the Dalai Lama, or the President, or the German Chancellor, or Osama bin Laden, or Bill Gates, whatever it happens to be, right? Liberalism acknowledges that the state does not completely control people within their own territories. The advent of mass communication has made interaction far more complicated, far more interactive. Now, where international organizations come in, kind of shoehorns itself between the first and the second, between the blue and the green, to work like this. Okay? Institutions are not necessarily a fourth level of analysis. They're not even like a hybrid between the first and the second. But they function kind of alongside that of states. They're above states because they have greater reach than states, but they do not and they will not take over the international level. They serve as somewhat of a catalyst or a facilitator for greater degrees of communication. So in this situation, states interact with the international level almost primarily today through institutions. Whether it's the United Nations, the European Union, the Southeast Asian Organization, the Organization of African States, the OPEC, you kind of get the idea, right? There is not one state that simply just speaks on behalf of the international arena, right? That just doesn't happen. And that never happens. Institutionalism acknowledges that the way in which international policy is sort of shaped and formed, particularly over the last 70 years or so, is through the use of institutions. What institutions also do is that they can bypass the state also to speak on behalf of individuals. So technically, you could, if you have an international grievance, and I really would like to know what you did in order to get an international grievance, that would be kind of neat. But if you have one, there's a special court for that. There's a special court in, I think, The Hague. The International Court of Justice is basically an international court that you could technically bring another country to trial for. If you feel that your rights have been violated, if international law has been circumvented, what happened? The point to be made here is that institutions provide a better facilitator for communication between states and also between the inhabitants of states. Okay? So far, so good? Yes? Okay, good. I turn to my TA sometimes just to make certain that I'm making sense.
And I was just laughing that the United States, you can't take the United States to the ICC.
It's probably, it's probably recommended that you don't sue the United States in the ICJ.
Nicaragua took the United States there and won in 1987.
They did?
Yeah.
Explain.
The United States placed mines in Nicaragua's harbors in order to blow up any ships that were bringing supplies in because we were fighting the Contra War. And Nicaragua brought a complaint about that to the court, and the court ruled against the United States. But
Interesting.
there were no consequences.
Ah, yes, because okay, I was waiting for that to be said.
Because we don't recognize.
Well, we just didn't even have to show up. let's put it that way. I mean, the United States could probably double park in a handicap zone just to, pay its, court fee, whatever. How much is that? Oh, $30 million? No, that's couch cushion change to me. Here it is. Take your change, whatever, not do anything about it. Yes, there is something to be said. You are getting a little bit ahead of me, but you're absolutely correct. Institutions do provide a certain way of meeting out grievances between states. The question of whether or not institutional decision can be enforced, that's a different story. That's, of course, a different story, to which the realists are just waiting for that but moment, okay? All right, so one thing to then look at, probably the first thing that we need to examine, is the relationship between institutionalism and sovereignty. And as I was, trying to get the point home to you guys, states effectively give up, for lack of better, terms, states effectively give up a portion of their sovereignty to some type of institutional third-party organization for the sake of benefits that cannot be obtained by themselves. All right, let me repeat that. States voluntarily give up elements of their sovereignty to a regulating body, whatever it happens to be, out of the need, out of the belief that they can get something more out of that institution than they can if they were by themselves. Okay, a couple of examples. Probably the best case of institutionalism around the world is economic cooperation. In fact, we could not have commercial pacifism without institutions. By itself, from a state-to-state relationship, commercial pacifism is pretty good. But when you've got a regulatory body making this thing important from Monday to Friday, chances are you're going to give that top priority. Economic cooperation can yield free trade. But free trade does have its possible setbacks. Right? Free trade is going to always gravitate towards the cheapest price for a good. This may undercut local businesses at home. This may cut into the proverbial mom and pop industries. Protectionism could keep them active, but yet states opt for free trade over protectionism. States will opt for free trade over protectionism. Okay, what about military cooperation? Right? The best example that we can give is NATO. Mearsheimer thought it was going to go the way of the dodo by the mid-1990s. Today, NATO actually is, well, active. NATO just kind of sat around and didn't do much from 45 to 90. NATO actually started doing stuff after 1990. Increasingly, we find that there are states in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, wherever it happens to be, that look at NATO as a major stepping stone for democratic consolidation. But yet joining NATO effectively means locking whatever military that you have into the decision-making hands of at least 30 other states. Now let's be honest. Let's be perfectly honest. What really makes NATO NATO? What really makes NATO NATO? The United States. Okay? We've got the biggest toys. We run up the bar tab all the time, but we use the company credit card, so we make everybody else pay for it as well. So when you join NATO, guess what you have to do? Your cute, quaint little army, which otherwise was more than a little bit more than an ethnographic showpiece, the minute that you join NATO, guess what you have to do? You have to modernize your army. You have to put your military tactics in standards with that of the United States, Great Britain, Germany, whatever, okay? That costs money. And what happens if one day you wake up and you find, oh, look at that, America decided to turn another country into a free democracy? Shucks. Guess what? You have to now contribute. You have to contribute to a war that you were like, I wasn't planning on doing this, but that's just what you have to do, okay? So when we talk about military cooperation here, we're also talking about putting reliance into the hands of foreign armies. Something that goes against the basic grains of sovereignty. Finally, diplomatic cooperation. And here I'm talking about formal institutions like the United Nations. and even the European Union. Okay? Diplomatic cooperation back in the day, a handshake, a gentleman's agreement between two ambassadors, two kings, two whatever it was. Constant diplomatic cooperation places trust in someone else's commitment to fulfill that bargain. So this is the other thing that realists will always argue against the virtues of institutionalism or long-term cooperation with other states. It kind of locks you into what another country is doing that may or may not benefit you. Institutionalism says, well, that's just part of the whole deal. That's just what we do. We have to remain vigilant. We have to remain active. We have to remain observant about how the rest of the world works, which means that we may end up paying a lot more than you bargained for. Okay. Let's also look at the relationship between institutions as state resources. Probably the best example of what an institution does comes from one of the most hardcore realists out there. The very same John Mearsheimer, as from a few years prior. An institution, according to Mearsheimer, is a set of rules that stipulate the ways in which a state should cooperate and compete with one another. Right? Real simple textbook definition. Right? Institution is a set of rules that stipulate the ways in which the state should cooperate and compete with one another. Yeah. As such, signing on to an institution as a member, agreeing to the terms and conditions, require states to abide by a set of rules, a set of objectives in which compliance and meeting those rules provide positive payoffs. Non-compliance of those rules risk the cost of defection, risk an image, your reputation as an image being sullied. And it provides a sort of acceptable and unacceptable modes of behavior. When you sign on to an institution, you agree to some form of rules of the game. And an institution works if and only if, let me repeat this, an institution works if and only if all participating members agree to abide by the proverbial rules of the game. Everybody follows the rules, we have harmony, we have cooperation. One or two states don't follow the rules, we have chaos. And guess what? You don't eat for that night because you should have hunted rabbits. So Mearsheimer sees, and most realists, and we'll get to that in greater detail next week, but realists look at institutions, if they look at them at all, and see it as a form of regulation. It's simply a way of keeping order, keeping, chaos from, spreading. Liberalists, and I specifically want to stay with the liberal camp today. Liberals look at institutions far more than that. And they see institutions as providing some form of regulation, but more importantly, institutions yield reciprocity. This is, really Robert Cohen's arguments, reciprocity. What do I get out of contributing to the group? What do I get out of paying my way in? What benefits do I get from being part of this organization? And there's lots of benefits, both tangible and intangible. The first and probably most important thing out of reciprocity is that information is shared. Information about others' preferences, intentions, behaviors, and goals are now shared. Hopefully, if all members of an institution are democratic, or at the absolute least abide by the principles of capitalism, they're all going to reveal their cards. They're all going to have the same main interest, and that is building up trade, expanding their economy, increasing the standard of living. If everybody wants that, no problem. You don't have to worry about sending a military to the border. Everybody has committed to do this. Here, great example. Really, really good example. The birth of the European Union began with an organization called the European Coal and Steel Commission. Take a guess at what the European Coal and Steel Commission traded in. Okay, don't think too hard here, okay? I think I may have mentioned this last week, but it's worth repeating. Who were the primary two members of the European Coal and Steel Commission? France, and more specifically, which Germany? West Germany, okay. So we're talking after the Second World War. French and the West Germans agreed to share their raw materials. The French have iron ore deposits, Germans have coal mines. Bring them two together, what do you get when you heat iron really, really hot? Steel. A primary mechanism for modern industrial architecture, construction, everything else like that. The Germans and the French agreed to pool their resources together to create effectively the first modern steel cooperative. Who else joins? There are 6 members of the European Coal and Steel Commission. I'll do the hard part for you. France and West Germany are the first 2. There's 4 other countries that join.
Luxembourg, Belgium, Italy, and Netherlands.
That's correct. Luxembourg, Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy. Great Britain is asked to join, and they say, bollocks to that. Okay? So you have 6 members. These are the original 6. Go on to form what will become the European Union today. It is not a surprise then, ladies and gentlemen. It is not a surprise. All 6 of these countries, at the absolute least, the geography around where these countries interact, some of the most developed areas of Europe today. The highest standards of living, one of the strongest economies. Why is that? Because over 50 plus years, concerted cooperation between them has effectively made all of these countries' goals in one harmonious unity. The need for a military became little more than an afterthought. The need for a security dilemma becomes almost unthinkable. So going back to what we were talking about last week, commercial pacifism. No 2 countries economically tied go to war with each other. Why? Because it's bad for business. Institutions basically take that one step further and make that economic cooperation legally binding. Legally binding. Also, last week, democratic peace theory. No 2 democracies go to war with each other. Hey, as far as the philosophy is concerned, that works. That's cool. But isn't it also beneficial to throw in an institution that makes it also legally binding? The thought of a democracy going to war with another democracy not only is bad as far as infrastructure, can you imagine the image that that country's reputation would suffer in newspapers around the world? Absolutely. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that at all. So when we talk about reciprocity here, we're effectively talking about almost perfect information about other countries' preferences, intentions, behaviors, and goals. Uncertainty is reduced to statistical 0. It's still there to a degree, but it becomes almost an afterthought. And finally, we note the relative gains from mutual aid and cooperation. This, of course, answers the question, what do I get out of what I pay in? So if you engage in transnational trade, what's the cost? Fraction of your sovereignty. And perhaps you don't get to monopolize one key industry. Okay, that's fine. But what do you get out of that? Well, you get deepened cooperation with one country. You get access to resources that are on the opposite side of your border. And C, you get something like steel that you would not be able to get on your own. That's the thing. If an institution can yield a payoff bigger than what your state could get if it acted alone, then all the more to continue with that institution. All the more to continue working with said institution. Institutionalism also functions as one of the first theoretical bridges between realism and liberalism. You know, up until now, some of you may have gotten the impression that realism and liberalism are kind of diametrically opposed. Not really. Now, as we get out of the theoretical elements and we talk more about real-world life, real-world applications, you'll find that realism and liberalism tend to work somewhat cooperatively. Institutionalism is something that the two sides can agree on. But whereas realism looks at institutions as a way of guaranteeing order, liberalism looks at institutions as something that uphold and defend justice. So, to go back to one of the first primary questions, why join? Why join an institution? The realist would say, well, one very simple reason. The payoffs for cooperation outweigh the penalties for defection. I can get more out than I could on my own. Cool. The liberalists will say the benefits of cooperation are greater than the benefits of acting alone, whether or not you ever joined. Realists will say continue operating because it's too costly to leave. Liberalists will say it's not even an issue. The benefits continue over and over again. You wouldn't even think of leaving. So it's more than just simply pay to play. Okay? Pay to play is what gets you in the door. But liberalists look at this and say that over time, what ends up happening is that the benefits no longer are seen as benefits. Over time, continued cooperation implies that benefits become your base. Let me repeat that. Over time, cooperation makes previously additional bonuses your base. Today, the Germans and the French don't look at their transnational trade as extra bonuses. They look at that as their platform. They look at that as the base of operations. Once that becomes your primary mechanism, cooperation is guaranteed. International organizations function also as a somewhat autonomous actor. Again, just to repeat what we were saying, collective bargaining among members yields payoffs that are greater than any individual input. Okay? Yields benefits that are greater than any individual payoff. What's also neat about institutions is that these organizations continue to function even after hegemonic decline. In other words, if institutions are originally founded by one or two particularly powerful countries that have the economic, the military, and the diplomatic clout to keep this thing going. It's almost like venture capital. When you start up a business, you need some kind of initial stimulus, some kind of down payment in order to make the company work. At some point, is it not feasible that continued returns on investments will keep going long after that initial startup money has gone? When we talk about after-hegemony, the United States is no longer as powerful a country as it was in the years immediately following the Second World War. And yet, even though there are new countries today that are making their name on the world, China, Russia, Iran, Brazil, India, whatever it is there a challenge to the post-war liberal economic hegemonic order that the United States created? No. The best proof of that is that the next rising economy, China, technically is communist, and yet it operates along principles of market capitalism. In other words, the United States could take a step back, and all participating members are still going to engage in this mutual, interdependent, cooperative venture simply because it pays off to continue to do so. The United States, if it wanted to, could withdraw from the United Nations today. Will the United Nations collapse if the United States withdraws? In some cases, it might even work better. Okay? Would the European Union collapse if Greece withdrew? No. Would the European Union collapse if Great Britain withdrew? Probably not. Would the European Union collapse if Germany withdrew? That's still out there, right? Give it a few more decades. Give it a few more decades, okay? The European Union and the United Nations are two different things. The European Union still gives us the impression that this thing is held together by one or two very powerful countries. The United Nations, on the other hand, was founded principally by the United States, but the United States no longer runs the show. More to the point, the liberal economic transatlantic trade system that we now come to know as the global free markets functions without the United States as the major contributor. There are other countries in the world today that are participating within that type of interdependent organization. long after the United States ceases to be a main country, or ceases to be the main leader. Okay? And that's simply because regulation and functionality perpetuate state cooperation. Secondly, the pressures to remain a member keep a state involved in that action, simply due to the cost of defection. Today, it is difficult, if not outright impossible, for Germany and France to pull their economic interdependencies apart. Why? Because both countries, both economies depend upon it. And secondly, reputation. Reputation also is a major aspect to this. And finally, international organizations facilitate informal policies that oftentimes function in place of international law. In the absence of any kind of international constitution, any kind of legally codified system of rules, which can be circumvented, okay? Smaller organizations provide terms and conditions for membership that keep states in line. They follow certain rules of procedure. They follow certain, protocols for interaction. That itself is a realist concept. What it also does is facilitate greater degrees of communication and cooperation. And that's all that I've got because I'm interested. You guys are awesome. See you next week.